Perfect. All right, great. So I was asked to chat about some of the DAO to DAO research that has been going on as a collaboration between PrimeDAO, Block Science, Curve Labs, Token Kitchen, and the Common Stack. A lot of the work that we've been doing ties into, just close some of these so we don't have disruptions during the presentation. Cool. Yeah, so sorry I didn't have time to pull together a specific slide deck for this, but I thought I would present and walk through some of the research digests that we've produced so far, and talk about some of the implementable primitives that have some promise for next stages of development in improving our kind of DAO relations toolkit. So in this first digest, we looked at DAOs through the framework of kind of the existing international relations literature. So, I mean, how do DAOs interoperate? How do they collaborate? Is kind of akin to how nation states interoperate, or even markets and firms in another context as well. So we did kind of a thorough rundown of DAO concepts and the history. I won't dive too much into detail of those because I'm sure most people here are quite familiar with the history of DAOs. We did spend a bit of time focusing on some definitions like autonomy and autonomous, and automation, and how these terms kind of guide our collective sense-making in these new institutional forms, and also just trying to get some clarity on what we mean with autonomy versus autonomous versus automation. We have to be very careful what we automate in these socioeconomic systems, because if we automate the wrong thing, we can quickly create kind of this dystopian AI-driven, AI is one of these buzzwords we hear for like beneficial optimization, but how do we know what we're optimizing for? So kind of keeping that those definitions clear and understood what we mean when we talk about decentralized autonomous organizations. Yeah, so there's a lot of history here. The concept as introduced by Vitalik and explored by some of the early pioneers in the crypto space. And kind of what we took away from this is that DAOs are kind of akin to cyber-physical systems. So cyber-physical systems are internet and social entangled technologies. So for example, like a power grid could be considered a cyber-physical system. You have prices that are going up and down. You have agents that are choosing to interact with this network as those prices go up and down. You have evolving power loads and demands and all these kinds of fluctuating variables within the system, which is very akin to DAO ecosystems. And of course, we are still in very early days, but ecosystems where tokens flow, and those tokens could represent money, they could represent governance, they could represent reputation between the agents. So we have these kinds of highly variable, dynamic, complex ecosystems. And bringing in some of the existing literature around cyber-physical systems will really help us to make sense of DAO ecosystems as we move forward. So we introduced a couple of conceptual models to understand DAOs. And again, in this kind of early sense-making period of these new institutions, we're kind of looking at all the different interaction patterns. So within a DAO, we have agent-to-agent interaction patterns. We have the agent-to-institution interaction. We have institution-to-agent patterns. So like, for example, the agent-to-institution may be, do I want to take on a proposal for this DAO, for example? Whereas the institution-to-agent may be, does the DAO tax contributors in this area, or for contributing, whatnot. Institution to institution is kind of the DAO to DAO level. So just understanding that there are multi-scale interactions here, both inter and intra-DAO, between the agents and the DAOs and these institutions as they unfold. So looking at some of the qualitative phenomena of DAOs and trying to quantify those. Again, we brought up the concept of Wittgenstein's ruler here. So in the nascent kind of DAO definition landscape, We can't just say, hey, this is how it is. We kind of have to create a metric to framework and then measure it against reality and then see, hey, did that metric we created, that Wittgenstein's ruler, actually measure something useful of this system? So we actually broke down 5 attributes of DAOs and characterized them on spectrums. So 5 of the most pertinent attributes of DAOs can be what kind of transaction costs are there in interacting with this DAO. And that could be monetary transaction costs. That could also be attention costs. It could be time costs. The information availability in these DAOs or institutions, their sovereignty level, their trust level, and their rigidity. So we go into a bit more definition here if you want to read with some more details. But ultimately, what we did was map these in kind of a radar chart so we can compare. And this was some idealized examples, of how a market institution compares to a firm-based institution, compares to a state-based institution, and anarchy was kind of this, idealized zero state where you have, no transaction costs, low information availability, sovereignty favoring the agents over the institution. The trust level is favoring, these competitive norms over cooperative norms, and very adaptive systems. So this is kind of an idealized example, and we mapped these out on a radar chart just to show how some of these different institutions compare. And then, of course, we did some of this early analysis on some specific DAOs. So Bitcoin has often been compared to a DAO. PrimeDAO, Google as an institution. OneHive is also a more one of the latest DAOs and really interesting in their explorations of computer-aided governance and using CAD for operational decision making. So just anyway, some early explorations of DAOs as institutions and how we can kind of quantify their characteristics to compare different classes of DAOs with each other or institutions more generally. Then we finished up the first research digest with looking at existing literature in international relations. So there's quite the existing scope on research in how organizations and sovereign nations interact without a shared legal structure. So most legal structures are inside the state that they operate in, but of course we have these international layers of cooperation, and some of the existing literature there can definitely inform our ideas of how DAOs collaborate and move forward in this new ecosystem. So that was our first research digest. I can drop a link in the chat for anyone interested to read further. I'll just drop this here now. Oops, got the wrong one. I'm having some issues dropping a link in the chat. Okay, there we go. Great. So I wanted to spend a bit of time going through our second research digest, which has more of a focus on the implementable tools with which we can extend these DAO interaction patterns to really see DAO-to-DAO interactions flourish, which actually we're seeing a lot of interest with a bunch of DAOs actually talking about mergers or joint ventures or co-funding research. Some really interesting opportunities on the horizon there. So we did a quick recap of the first work cycle, which we won't go into too much detail. Maybe I'll just drop a quick mention that we kind of have these different layers of research, basic research, kind of blue sky research turning into applied research. Once we have these exciting directions for implementation, we can do a bit more applied research, which can then, of course, turn into the development of these primitives or mechanisms that we then implement in day-to-day operations. So kind of this, we thought this research and development coordination cycle was useful to convey how we go from kind of blue sky basic research to application in development and ultimately deploying these tools in DAOs so we can see these new interaction patterns kind of opening up. So I won't go into detail on the recap. We'll just skip by that. And if you're interested in more information, the link is in the chat. So some of these recurring systems patterns that we've seen kind of cropping up across the DAO ecosystem. Lots of groups interested in joint ventures, in governance swaps or token swaps, where we see lots of existing institutions. Actually, Pat put out a great piece on this not too long ago. I don't know if you're still here, Pat. Maybe you want to drop the link to that in the chat. And it talks about equity swaps among existing institutions and how widespread that is in the world today. So kind of looking to replicate those processes within DAO to DAO collaboration seems to make a lot of sense. But how we do that is the question. How do we, what kind of token contracts are needed? What kind of agreements? What kind of negotiations are required for these kinds of collaborations? So that's kind of what we're diving further into here. Some of those mechanisms required may be, collateral lock and payout mechanisms or escrow mechanisms, where we can have kind of game theoretically sound collaborations where when both organizations commit to a path of further inquiry, one doesn't back out at the last second and leave and free ride on the organization that did go all in. So kind of coming up with these new mechanisms to ensure that we have trustless negotiation primitives, or as trustless as we can make them anyway, to ensure we see these kinds of collaborations moving forward. We also posit about the non-monopolistic nature of DAOs, and we're going to do a bit more writing about this in the future, but we think there's some really interesting positive feedback loops here, where DAOs, being voluntary opt-in organizations, do not require the complete monopolization of time and attention of their contributors, like we see in traditional firms, where often employees, have to sign NDAs and promise to not share any of the research that came out of a research initiative, even though that research may benefit multiple different organizations who are working towards the same, and especially in the public good space. This is something that we see as a massive leverage that DAOs can unlock, in that multiple DAOs funding open research can have massive knock-on synergies compared to sort of proprietary research done by firms who monopolize contributor attention. So definitely some interesting areas for DAO collaboration, and some of the most promising and high leverage areas that we've identified for these kind of DAO to DAO interactions is in exactly that co-funding of research, especially around public goods, and joint ventures. So in other words, a lot of the work that's being done within individual DAOs could be much more easily funded by multiple DAOs. And also we can see collaborations that don't require the additional overhead of creating a new DAO. I mean, it's wonderful that we are continuing to build these tools that make institutions easier to create on demand, but at a certain point we have this overhead where not every initiative needs to be a new DAO. And I've seen that myself in several research groups. As soon as 2 or 3 different organizations get involved around a research question, someone goes, "Hey, should we DAO this?" And I mean, that's great and all, that we can have DAOs where they're appropriate. But it's also important that we create these kinds of tools that allow joint ventures without having to incur the additional overhead cost of creating a new community, a new DAO, potentially a new token, new governance processes, etc. So really, we're kind of looking at this intersection area between 2 DAOs and say, this doesn't have to be a third DAO. It could be if it's appropriate, but maybe it would be more beneficial to use some of these joint venture or co-funded research primitives that we'll talk about just below. So one of the mechanisms that we identified, primarily from a personal pain point, is building mechanisms that allow, rather than people collaborating to support a DAO, which has been most of the conversation in the DAO space, is how do people collaborate on a DAO? We're kind of flipping that around and saying, how can DAOs collaborate to support their contributors, especially contributors who are working between multiple DAOs. We see a lot of kind of DAO alliances forming up, and yeah, lots of collaborators are sharing work between multiple DAOs, but also incurring occasionally heavy admin overhead by doing so. So collaborating with a DAO, first you have to put in a proposal, so you have to scope out what you're going to do, put in a proposal, convince the community that this is a worthwhile proposal, then of course receive funding if that proposal passes, do the work, and then bring that work back to the community and show that you've produced that value in order to have subsequent proposals passed. Of course, the overhead of this compounds quite a bit when you throw in 2, 3, or 4 DAOs, especially if you're working on similar work, but you have to submit proposals to multiple DAO ecosystems. So here's kind of a quick diagram that shows, DAOs today kind of operate like this, where you have the DAO and you have multiple proposals in that DAO. When those proposals are passed, people go out and they do the work, they receive the funds. And what we're proposing is essentially a kind of a way to invert this, so that rather than a DAO having a bunch of proposals, we can flip it and say multiple DAOs can collaborate on a shared proposal. So as mentioned above, some of the difficulties with DAO tools today is the admin overhead. I mean, when we look at the boundaries of the firm, employees are really set free to do work by things like HR and payroll, and taking over some of the administrative tasks that freelance employees don't necessarily have, or DAO contractors don't really have the luxury of. So we see in the regular proposal process, we spend quite a bit of time writing proposals. Then for more complex contracts, we have to do subcontractor payroll and time tracking. Then we have a small period of doing work after having to review subcontractor work and then justify to the DAO what work was done. The idea with the proposal inverter process is we're just expanding that productive work time and trying to relegate some of those administrative and payroll HR processes to these mechanisms. So this mechanism kind of provides like decentralized HR functionality, semi-automated payment flows, and kind of pre-negotiated contracts. So here's a diagram that explains how this might work. So for example, we have a trusted contractor squad or a research team at the bottom here. And at the top, we have multiple DAOs that can fund this research team through the proposal inverter mechanism. So this is kind of like a payments extension in a way for a DAO. So you can have multiple DAOs feeding into this pool of funds. They can feed in different amounts. And of course, this can include a DAO negotiated joint venture, which may be facilitated by the conditional tokens framework, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Then this pool of funds is kind of rate limited to flow out according to a contractor negotiated allocation policy. So let's say this contractor squad or research team decides that they're going to pay out 5% of this pool of funds per month, or perhaps $5,000 out of this pool per month. These funds can then flow through semi-automated payment gateways to the contractor squad and reduce some of that overhead in payroll management and whatnot. The great thing about this tool is it's also persistent. It doesn't have to exist within a work cycle of a single DAO. It can be a tool that spans multiple work cycles and multiple DAOs. So rather than a research team having to submit a proposal for each work cycle for each DAO that they're operating under, they can just have one payment, the proposal inverter mechanism set up. Multiple DAOs can feed into that on an ongoing basis, and those funds can flow out to the research team or the trusted squad on a regular basis as well. So this is actually an assemblage mechanism. We talked a lot about primitives, mechanisms, and assemblages. Primitives are kind of like the smallest Lego block you can possibly build. Then, of course, you can stack those primitives into assemblages, which are more complex mechanisms that can do more advanced things. So we kind of broke down the proposal inverter mechanism into three different layers of primitives. So some technology actually already exists that exhibits some of this behavior. We are just approaching it from the research angle, pointing to a lot of the technology that's out there, pointing to where it can be used for the purposes that we're discussing it, and then looking at how we can integrate what's already out there with what it's needed for, and build reliable mechanisms for DAO-to-DAO interactions. So kind of the first level primitive in this tool is a flow wallet, as we've termed it. So it's kind of like a splitter in an electrical circuit. Whatever comes in is split and goes out. So we can see that's kind of what this wallet is doing. The funds that come in get split to a bunch of contributors. So the Disperse app already provides sort of this functionality. You can send funds to a number of proposals at once. And an example of this, if we had 3 trusted contractors of the DAO, if there was a one-time $5,000 payment, they have an agreed allocation policy of 50%, 25%, 25% based on the time input, earning them the corresponding amount of the one-time payment from the DAO. The next primitive that we can stack on this is rate limiting these flow wallets. So this is basically integrates leaky integrator functionality. So a leaky integrator is an electrical engineering term, and this kind of includes temporal flows into the mechanism. So you can think of a leaky integrator like a bucket with a hole in the bottom. So when funds flow in, it doesn't necessarily that the funds all flow out all at once, but they flow out at a rate which we mentioned here. This allocation rate is determined by the contractor group, and they can determine how much flows out at a regular basis. So some of these already, Sablier is a fund streaming tool. Superfluid is another really neat kind of fund streaming mechanism, and the Commune app is actually one of the. I think it's fairly recent, but it was a really neat way to split funds among a group of friends who need them, for example. But I mean, that technology can also be ported over and used for a group of DAO collaborators. So the example here, the only difference between the first primitive is now we're rate limiting the flow out. So it's not necessarily all of the funds that are in the wallet, it's just a portion of the funds that is decided by that contractor allocation policy. We have a third layer that we can add on to this assemblage mechanism, and this is adding a dynamic allocation policy to a rate-limited flow wallet. So if we are talking about a group of 3 contractors, it's fairly small scale, it's fairly simple to come to agreement on an allocation policy between these 3 contractors. But as we move into more and more advanced systems, we'll likely need more either permissionless or scalable, semi-permissionless scalable tools for that. So introducing the dynamic allocation policy into this requires the introduction of a bonding curve. Now, granted, we don't have to go to the whole, we're not launching a whole new economy with this bonding curve. This bonding curve is just managing access rights to a portion of that revenue allocation. So this could allow a dynamic allocation policy between contributors. So different contributors can join, can leave, different contributors can contribute, and actually this added mechanism will allow for more complex behaviors in the ecosystem as well. So we see in the graph, this is similar to the graph's delegator role, where we could have contractors or external agents or VCs, if they wish to delegate those tokens to signal support for work they see as valuable, they can opt into this bonding curve to point out and signal valuable research teams, and thus draw more funding to those research teams to make sure that that work gets done. So yeah, there's some really interesting kind of higher order effects. Of course, a little bit further down the complexity rabbit hole, but important for the long-term sustainability of these kinds of systems. So some of the benefits of the proposal Inverter, just to recap briefly, it offers persistent cross-DAO semi-automated payments infrastructure. This can be used to fund shared research initiatives. In particular, we see tons of funding pouring into the research of AMMs and bonding curves. A lot of this is done privately by organizations who are interested in capitalizing on this new technology. We believe that this research would be far more beneficial to the ecosystem as open source research that can be developed on by everybody. So this is kind of some of those types of research initiatives that we would love to see this primitive applied for. In early discussions with the OneHive community and others, we also realized that this kind of primitive is quite important for supporting community management and care work. So that kind of work that is hard to specify in advance, or kind of the non-checkbox labor. If you are a developer team developing a pre-specified component, it's very easy to say, okay, this has to be done, this has to be done, this has to be done, check, check, check. Okay, cool, this proposal has been completed. But not all work fits so neatly into kind of those checkbox labor mentality. So definitely eager to see how the proposal inverter could help to recognize and support kind of these more invisible community resources. And of course, when we can start supporting those community resources, we really hit economies of scale in like DAO or squad specialization. So I know we've seen this with a lot of groups already, like Raid Guild and a lot of the other DAOs that are kind of working in between a bunch of different groups. Once we get these kind of economies of scale in specialization, the next step is learning how to share these resources between DAOs and how to, as I said earlier, to have the DAOs support the contributors rather than the contributors supporting the DAOs. Another interesting application, more on the sort of DeFi side of things, is that this tool could be used to fund a collective liquidity pool. So when we look at how we're allocating who this goes to, these don't necessarily have to be people's wallets necessarily. This could be a bunch of DAOs contributing funds or tokens or liquidity to a common liquidity pool. So really great observation from one of the researchers in our team to talk about, co-funding of mutual liquidity pools. So very, very interesting stuff there. But we're still in the early days of exploration for a lot of these tools. So we don't have, hard answers. We don't have, everything is, even the naming of some of these terms are still kind of at the engineering layer. We expect to see these evolve somewhat and turn into more deployable, implementable tools in the coming months. I'm pretty excited about that. Another primitive that was identified, and I won't go into as much detail because the experts on this are definitely the good folks over at Curve Labs. But looking at the Gnosis conditional tokens framework to facilitate joint ventures on behalf of DAO collaborations. So a quick overview of the conditional tokens framework. It was actually developed for the use case in Gnosis prediction markets. So whether a market resolves true or false, this is a token framework that was used to kind of create these combinatorial decisions that can then resolve back to a payout either in the condition of yes or no on a series of decisions. So this as in their use in prediction markets, or also their use in DAO to DAO collaborations, we can have either shallow conditions or kind of these deeper combinatorial conditions. We can see one just below here. I'm not sure if it will be big enough to read. A little bit, yeah. So we can see, a shallow condition could be, for example, will DAO1 fund the joint venture? There is a yes position and a no position. And then we can stack on the second condition, will DAO2 fund the joint venture? So we're kind of asking, will DAO1 fund? If yes, will DAO2 fund? If, so we've got these, here's the combinatorial condition here. So will DAO1 and DAO2 fund? Will DAO1 fund and will DAO2 not fund? So we can kind of have these interesting combinatorial decisions, and then the tokens will only resolve if the conditions are yes and yes. If not, then no funds are sent. So it's an interesting mechanism where we can have basically two DAOs opt into a joint venture, and if either one pulls out, then no funds will be sent. But if both opt in and both stay true to their word, then the funds will go forward and the joint venture can ensue. So there's considerably more development work that's gone into the conditional tokens framework. Definitely Curve Labs are the experts on exactly where we are at with the conditional tokens framework, but in terms of the research of what type of new collaboration patterns are opened up between DAOs, we're really excited to see this moving forward through the development pipeline, and yeah, it's pretty soon to be an implementable primitive in the PrimeDAO ecosystem, as long as there are no other exploits or difficulties determined along the way. As we kind of brought up in this first, this one, there are a lot of sort of self or feedback loops that need to go into the development of any tool. We really have to question our assumptions, often going back to the design phase, looking at, in the applied research phase, how is this going to be implemented, where, yeah, basically just going back and questioning assumptions, making sure that we are, using these tools appropriately, and making sure that within the constraints of the system, using CAD as a validation tool, modeling and testing these types of tools before we deploy, and realize that actually we're beyond the stage of just designing in a white paper and then deploying tools. We really want to make sure that we validate and test each system component before we are deploying tools that may take our DAOs in different directions than we intended. So that's pretty much the end of our research digest that we've published thus far. We do have a couple more digests that are going to be coming out over the next few weeks, talking more about power structures in DAOs, talking more about the theory of the firm, and sort of the new role that DAOs play as this blend of market and firm. So yeah, some pretty interesting DAO to DAO research still to come. But we're excited to hear how the PrimeDAO community is interested in using these primitives, and yeah, whether there's any further interest in help to further research and deploy these kinds of primitives. And I guess we have a few minutes left. I'm not sure what time we've got. I hope I didn't go over, but if there are any questions, I think we should have about 5 minutes or so. Yeah, I'm just reading some of the messages here. Yes, very, yeah, One Hive is working on very similar. Actually, I don't think I gave them the shout out that we put in here. There is, yeah, some, where did we mention One Hive? Here we are. Yeah, so using modeling and simulation tools like CAD to inform DAO decision making is a trend that's very likely to increase. And that's why we see, as an industry, this focus on research, education, and tooling is so important. So yeah, notably, One Hive just did a CAD model to validate their dynamic issuance policy for the Honey token, and this is not only for the One Hive ecosystem, but this model can now serve as a foundation for any other DAO who's interested in creating a sustainable long-term token issuance policy. And they can now use this CAD model. They can take it, they can fork it, they can change some of the parameters, some of the assumptions, and more rapidly explore simulated token dynamics in DAO ecosystems in the future. So definitely, One Hive is a very forward-looking community and DAO in terms of using these tools for operational decision making. Really exciting stuff. Get another question. Great. What do you believe how a malicious DAO could act within such a framework, and how could we see these malicious DAOs developing? Yeah, that's a really good question, and thanks for dropping the link to the dynamic supply policy. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky question. DAOs, being the sort of permissionless institutions that they are, we can expect to see all sorts of like dark DAOs or shadow DAOs malicious DAOs that are trying to do things that probably a lot of the community would find disingenuous or even dangerous. So ultimately, when we're building these tools, we have to be aware of how they can be used for bad as well as for good, and of course, design as many protections as we can to protect against their misuse, for sure. I think in my mind, a lot of the protection against these kind of dark DAOs, dark communities, or dark shadow DAOs is people have the power to vote with their feet. And I think there is, there's this dark corner of the internet, just like there will be a dark corner of Web3. And this is where, there always will be some level of interaction, but I believe that when people can choose to opt into the societies that, the institutions that support their, views and outlook on the world, and vote with their dollars, there always will be this shadowy corner of the internet, and there will be, that will be augmented with DAOs and Web3 in the coming years, absolutely. But I think we'll see the size of those kind of DAOs and economies as being very minimal compared to the mainstream. And also, I'm interested in the kinds of like economic sanctions that light DAOs can put on dark DAOs. We currently in foreign relations, we see whole nations, placing economic sanctions on whole other nations, and often those sanctions are just to punish a very small number of people in those. The vast majority of North Koreans, the vast majority of anyone in these sanctioned countries aren't actually creating problems for the United States or any other economic power, but they are the ones that are disproportionately hit by those sanctions. So I'm curious into the ability for DAO alliances to directly economically sanction those dark DAOs or malicious DAOs, and really restrict the financial and economic flows for the people who are directly espousing these ideas, rather than putting economic sanctions on someone just because of the place that they were born. They happen to be born in North Korea doesn't necessarily mean that they deserve to be economically sanctioned, but someone who voluntarily participates in a dark and malicious DAO, can be economically sanctioned, perhaps at some point in the future, using some of these kinds of DAO to DAO collaboration tools. So yeah, very, very important and interesting question to consider in the future. Are there any other questions that were dropped in here? Oh,